And without further ado, I'll let Zach take the floor and talk to us.
Well, thank you so much, James, and thanks everyone who's on. Like James said, if you have any questions, feel free to type them in the type box. There's a text bubble in the bottom left-hand corner that will open up the text bubble, and if I see it in the flow of conversation, I will try to answer it. Otherwise, I might come to it at the end if we have a little bit of time. And I'm actually actively recording this webinar right now, just so I make everyone aware of that. And we will post this on our statewide local food system small farm page when I get it uploaded. So this title slide you see here, this is going to be a part of what we're calling our small farm webinar series. We do a winter webinar series starting in January for 14 weeks, but I think because distance learning is becoming such a popular trend, we are probably going to be doing a lot more of these webinars where people can sign on and participate online rather than in person. So the title of this, Want to Expand Your Growing Season, this is going to be just a general overview of season extension, structures, and management, mainly for the small market gardener, but I have a few slides where we can talk a little bit about how these structures can be utilized in a backyard setting as well. And a lot of the principles that we talk about in terms of management would apply to these scenarios as well. So, and again, this is just going to be a general overview. I can foresee that this topic is very dense. There's a lot to season extension and high tunnel management where we could expand upon this and turn this into an actual more extended webinar series that we can discuss further issues later on. But for now, we're just going to the basis of this will just be kind of an overview, looking at structures and some management and cultural techniques with high tunnels in particular for year-round production. So this first slide here, this is a really good place to start, and I often like to start my season extension talks with a slide like this. And what this graph that you see represents is three different production systems. The green line represents a farm or an operation that might be doing either its sales or harvesting throughout the entire 12-month calendar year. The red line represents an operation that may have some form of season extension, whether it's structures or other cultural techniques, and the months that they're expanding their harvesting to. And that really sort of steep, sharply shaped bell curve in the black represents what a traditional seasonal sales trend would be for a traditional market gardener, or for most of us who are used to just growing produce during the regular calendar year in our backyard. And this is a good sort of visualization of what season extension can do for you. Whereas if you're just relying in a temperate climate like here in Harding Zone 5A, 5B, or 6A for us in southern Illinois, for some of us in southern Illinois, our harvesting curve is that black curve. So we start to really begin ramping up harvesting from our garden, our market garden, towards the end of April into May. We sort of peak out in July and August, and then that curve sharply starts to go downwards into the end of October to the first hard freeze, depending on if we have fall crops or root storage crops in the field or in our garden. Whereas if you apply season extension techniques, whether it's a high tunnel or other cultural techniques, you can start to flatten that curve out a little bit and sort of expand your harvesting into the shoulder season. So that's what the red curve represents. So that might be, say for instance, if you just had a high tunnel and you wanted to start your warm season crops 6 weeks earlier, or some other crops maybe a little bit earlier than that, you could expand your harvest season a little bit further to the left in late winter, early spring, and then a little bit further to the right in the fall. And your total sales volume, or the total amount that you're harvesting, kind of flattens out. And that green curve line is a representation of, if you are a true year-round production system with your high tunnels, how you could really flatten your curve out to have production and harvesting every single month of the year and sort of flatten out your curve. So season extension for a market gardener is really important on either right or left of this bell-shaped shaped curve. It really allows you to expand your season into what they call the shoulder seasons, and in fact it is even possible to do over winter or winter production in these high tunnel structures. So this next slide is just kind of a bullet point of why one might consider season extension. So we talked a little bit there, actually pretty extensively, about how you can extend your growing season into what we call these shoulder seasons or into the winter as well. And that can allow you to increase your marketing and cropping opportunities. So tomato is a great example. In the middle of the summer, in August through September, farmers markets are saturated with tomatoes and the price really evens out. If you're a grower who wants to be the first person to market with vine ripe tomatoes, utilizing a season extension structure like a high tunnel will allow you to bring those tomatoes vine ripe 6 to 7 weeks earlier than you could from your outdoor production. So it really allows you to find some of those niche opportunities to get the highest prices for certain crops like tomatoes. If you're expanding your season, you're also increasing your revenue per square foot. We'll talk a little bit about the amount of revenue that you want to be generating per square foot in these structures, because they're such a high valuable real estate in terms of what you're wanting to get for gross yields. But you can definitely increase your revenue per square foot because you're growing multiple crops on every single square foot. In fact, you could be growing 3 to 4 crops per square foot every single year, whereas outdoor production, you're getting 1, maybe 2, depending on how savvy you are with your succession and production planning for the season. You can absolutely increase your crop quality and yield. That's probably one of the biggest benefits for growing in high tunnels, particularly something like tomatoes, where the incidence of foliar diseases, which can be devastating for outdoor tomatoes, are very reduced, if not non-existent, inside of a high tunnel structure. So you can definitely increase crop quality and yield, enhance environmental control. So when we start talking about these high tunnel structures, these are not fully automated systems. These are passively heated systems that we're using microclimate creation via solar energy. Okay, so we're creating microclimates just with this one layer of plastic, and then also integrating even low tunnels inside of the high tunnels themselves. We will talk a little bit about how you could input heat, but that's a little bit later. So there is enhanced environmental control over just normal outdoor growing. Reduce incidence of plant disease pressure. Absolutely, I already alluded to that. And in some cases, you can also reduce the incidence of insects if you do a few things like, put insect netting on your where your roll-up sides are, or some sort of detail like that. Whereas insect pressure can be the similar, if not compounded, in a high tunnel, depending on if they establish a little niche inside the tunnel. But there are things you can do to manage that, especially if you're putting up a new structure. There are things you can do to prevent insects from getting inside the structure in the first place. But there's absolutely a reduction in plant diseases, particular foliar diseases, and particular foliar diseases that are caused from splash up from planting crops into bare soil. There's just not the same level of disease from those diseases in a high tunnel. There can be sort of humidity and moisture-based diseases like downy mildews, even in the winter months, but it's significantly reduced in a tunnel. Protection from weather, particularly wind, is one of the biggest things. Although frost and hail damage, it absolutely is protecting from those things as well. Labor efficiency. Absolutely, because that green curve that we started off with, the green line that we started off with, it allows a high tunnel. If you're doing primarily high tunnel or protected cultivation, you're spreading your workload out over the entire season rather than focusing primarily on outdoor production, where you have a real peak in labor demands to harvest all that produce in the middle of the season. So it's possible, if you want to become a year-round farmer with high tunnels, to really even the workload out and spread your labor out over the entire year and work regardless of weather. So in terms of terminology, let's really quickly, because James mentioned the hoop house, high tunnel, let's just quickly talk about that, because there's a lot of confusion out there about that. Virtually, hoop house and high tunnel are the same thing. Okay. The reason why we might use the term high tunnel is to differentiate it from a low tunnel, and particularly to differentiate it from that when we're using a low tunnel inside of a high tunnel. But a high tunnel and hoop house are essentially the same thing. They're just a plastic covered greenhouse structure where we either have minimal automation or very minimal to no heat input. A greenhouse, on the other hand, or a fully automated greenhouse, is typically a more permanent structure. There's more automation, and you're often supplementing it with heat. And I'll show you an example of how you could use a high tunnel as a greenhouse and sort of vice versa. So they're kind of, all these terms are interchangeable, but for the purpose of this talk, when we say hoop house or high tunnel, we're virtually talking about the same thing. It's just a greenhouse type structure with usually just 1 to 2 layers of polyethylene plastic over the top of it. So in terms of the shape that we might deal with, or roof geometry might be another way that we would say this, there's usually 4 different sort of categories, and you can see them here. So in the top left, that sort of semicircle, half circle shape that rests on the ground is sort of the classic hoop house or cold frame or high tunnel shape. We call that a Quonset. And there are some benefits to that, but one of the drawbacks is snow load. And we'll see an example of how snow can build up on a high tunnel. And usually, if you're going to be doing something year-round or have something called what we would call a 4-season structure, you'd want to move away from a Quonset and move to one of these other types of structures. So cathedral, gable, Gothic. I've often referred to all 3 of those other roof geometries kind of in general as Gothic. There's a little bit, and we don't have to get super technical here, but at the bottom, the gable and Gothic, there's really not too much difference to that, other than maybe the gable is at more of a straight 45-degree angle from the roof top down to where the roll-up sides might be, or what we would call the side walls. In a Gothic structure, that straight line might be a little bit more bowed, as you would see in the bottom right-hand picture. But in general, the cathedral, Gothic, gable have a little bit more of a sharper angle, typically a 45-degree angle, that makes snow shed much easier. So these are structures and the shapes that you would want if you were trying to do a 4-season production in the winter months to deal with snow loads. And there's also something to be said about the angle of that roof shape. So a 45-degree angle allows a little bit more light in during the winter months and refracts a little bit more light during the summer months, which is helpful during the summer because the temperatures inside of a tunnel in the middle of the summer are super hot, whereas in the winter, that lower angle of the sun in the winter, that 45-degree angle, lets a little bit more light in and therefore heats up the tunnel a little bit more when we need that additional heat in the summer. So that's just a little conversation about roof geometry. So let's move on to talk about some considerations in considering season extension technologies or structures into your overall farm goals, or even if you're just a backyard grower, maybe some of the reasons why you might want to have production in the background. So you might want to ask yourself, what's your ideal ratio of covered to uncovered space? The picture on the right that you see here is of a high tunnel we had at the student farm that I managed down at the main campus. And we had approximately 14,000 square feet of high tunnel or protected cultivation space. And we grew on about 2.5 acres. And that represents maybe about 5 to 10% of our total space. But in terms of yield, the high tunnels, because we can grow so much more in them, up to 3 to 4 crops per square foot every single calendar year, you can multiply that 5 or 6% times 4, and that would represent about 25 to 30% of our total yields for all of that 2.5 acres. So that just kind of shows you, if you have the right ratio of protected cultivation, high tunnel or season extension cultivation to just regular outdoor cultivation, how you might want to dial in the proper ratio for your farm, depending on what you want to do in the space that you have to work with. Do you want your structures to be movable or stationary or static high tunnels, and we'll talk about the benefits and drawbacks of those in a slide. Heated versus unheated, we will talk a little bit about some benefits to adding a little bit of additional heat to these normally unheated systems. What percentage of your revenue do you want to be growing from your covered spaces? And what will the primary use of the high tunnel be? So typically we're going to be talking about growing crops in the ground inside of one of these structures. As you see in this picture right here, we have baby salad greens growing during the winter months. But you can also use high tunnels for some other things as well, and we'll look at a few of those considerations. So let's just talk for a little bit about high tunnels specifically, or hoop houses, as we can interchangeably call them. So high tunnels are typically larger structures that are designed for 3 to 4 season production, depending on, again, the roof geometry, the shape, and what you want to do with it on your farm. So in the right-hand picture, I've put in a bunch of terms that we can kind of go over, some terminology if you're unfamiliar with the terminology. So starting sort of at 12 o'clock, that the truss term is that line is pointing at that truss structure that connects a bow together and provides a little bit additional roof stability from snow loads and wind loads. As we move to the right, there's that term purlin, which is that long sort of unbent piece that runs down the length of the structure. And in this case, with this movable high tunnel, there's actually 5 purlins that run down the length. One of them at the very top of the ridge, and then there's 4 that go down either side to reinforce the structural integrity of the high tunnel down the length of the structure. So the roll-up side, if you look to the right, you can see that in this case we have part of the high tunnel, we have the side just starting to roll up a little bit, and that's your main source for ventilation. Now you see I have that term end wall, and what that represents is the wall at either end of the structure. And in terms of ventilation management, not only would you want to have the roll-up sides as one of your main mechanisms for ventilation and temperature control, but it's also critical that you might also have vents in your end wall as well. So keep that in mind. The bow or hoop is sort of the main component of these structures. So you call it a bow or a hoop. In this case, for this 30 by 96 structure, I believe that there's 24 of these bows, and they're at 4-foot spacing. That's the main structural component. In this case, this is that sort of gable or Gothic style bow that you see here. And on the far left-hand side, I have a couple labels that talk about the hip board and kick board. The hip board is usually either a wiggle wire channel or a 2x6 with a wiggle wire channel on it. That's where you actually attach the plastic down the length of the tunnel and serves as part of the roll-up side mechanism as well. And then there's the kick board, which is usually a board that runs down the length at the bottom to sort of provide a little bit more lengthwise support. The bigger the structure, the better, let's say that. So we'll look at an example of some smaller backyard systems that you could utilize. But in general, if you have a bigger structure, you're going to maximize the thermal gain. There's going to be more airspace and more soil for the sun to heat up and that tunnel to trap in place and create a better microclimate. So the bigger the structure, the more thermal gain that you get. There's varying materials in terms of the framing, but in general, whether you're making a DIY high tunnel or you're purchasing a kit from a company, galvanized steel frame is pretty much the common material. There are pre-bent kits and pre-manufactured kits that you can purchase, but you can also bend your own, and we're going to look at that too. Varying levels of automation that I've sort of already alluded to. This is just an average, so in terms of investment, you're looking at around $3 per square foot for these larger structures and up. And we'll look at some examples here as we move forward. So in terms of the pipe gauge and sort of diameter and thickness of that steel framing, there's a few terms that you can look at here to sort of go over when you're shopping around here. So pipe gauge, when it comes to that, it comes in, from 12, 14, 16, 18 gauge. In general, the lower the gauge, the thicker the pipe and the more material and the more sort of snow loads and wind loads that it can take. So a 14 gauge pipe has 43% more material than a 17 gauge pipe. So just thinking of that. And the other thing too is the bigger the pipe, so if the diameter of the pipe, the outside diameter of the pipe, if you combine that with a lower gauge, you have more material and more structural stability. So that's just giving you an example of that. And usually when you're shopping around, all of that will be in sort of the features or documentation for these kits that you're trying to purchase. And that may also come into play in terms of weight. If you're trying to unload it from a trailer, knowing how much these kits would weigh, so you can unload a kit like this from a flatbed trailer at your house to be able to put one of these things up. But the main reason why this steel is so important and the thickness of the steel has a lot to do with the management of the structural integrity. So this is a picture right here of my former assistant manager, who's now the manager of the Sustainable Student Farm down on campus, Matt Torino. This picture was taken on the outside of one of our high tunnels at the end of March in 2013, I believe. If you guys remember, we had a massive blizzard that year where we got around 13 inches of snow, and this is on the south side of one of these tunnels where most of the snow has shed off the top, so you can see the top of the plastic, and on the other side all the snow is completely shed off, but it tends to drift on the south side of these structures depending on where the wind's coming from, and that is a lot of snow load on that structure. So if it's not shedding most of it, or the gauge or thickness of the steel isn't strong enough, you can often have collapse of these structures. And it's not as big of a problem in the Midwest, but particularly in the Northeast where they use these structures, snow load is super critical. So making sure that you have the right roof geometry and the right gauge and thickness of that pipe is super critical, especially if you want to do it during the winter months. And here, even when we had that little bit of snow drift on the side of the tunnels, we still would go out with brooms, push the snow off, and pull some of that off so it wasn't pushing on the side of the tunnel and moving it off the track in this case, because this is a movable tunnel. You still have to do a little bit of snow management. And we'll see another example of that with the Quonset tunnel in a little bit. So really quickly, we'll just kind of go through a few price point examples for different manufacturers of these pre-made kits. And I'm not endorsing any one of these tunnels in particular. This just kind of gives you a general idea of what these might cost. Okay, so we generally refer to this in a cost per square foot is how we like to do it. And so this first example is from a company called FarmTech. I've never worked with a tunnel like this, but this is their Gothic style tunnel. All of these are going to be 30 by 48 foot structures with a 4-foot hoop spacing. And this is just the frame itself and probably the plastic and some of the bracing. But this one doesn't have a truss kit, so there's no truss to further strengthen the bows, and you still have to source the materials for the end walls, whether that's tube steel or 2x4 material. That's up to you. But this is just kind of all those other things sort of even. This is kind of the general cost of the kit. So here we're looking at around $3.80 per square foot for a FarmTech structure. For a Rimmel type structure of the same size, it's a little bit more, maybe about 10 cents more, but still around just slightly less than $4 per square foot. And this is also before freight costs as well, which can be anywhere from $800 to $900 depending on where you're purchasing this kit from. So Rimmel, the tunnels that we had at the student farm were actually Rimmel structures. We had a type of structure called the Rolling Thunder, which is a movable structure we'll look at in a second. So this is another company called Four Season Tools. This is a newer company. Similar, a little bit cheaper in cost for their non-movable structures. Their movable structures are pretty fancy. This is kind of one of those companies out there that's on the cutting edge and main thought leaders in terms of really high-tech movable tunnels, and those can be quite costly, but this non-movable tunnel is a little bit cheaper. And part of that reason, if you look at these bullets here, is that they use 14 gauge steel, and I guess all of these are using 14 gauge steel, but they use a slightly thicker outside diameter pipe, and they have 6-foot hoop spacing instead of 4-foot hoop spacing. So that outside diameter is a little bit more material, a little bit more structurally sound, and they can use less hoops at a wider spacing, and that brings the cost down just a little bit. So for these prefab kits like this is a good general sort of cost figure. $3 to $4 per square foot is generally what we say. The fancier the end wall, the fancier the ventilation systems, you're going to add more to that. And if you add movability to these structures, you're maybe looking at adding another $1 per square foot as well. But compared to fully automated greenhouses that run anywhere between $15 to $30 per square foot, that you can see the cost payback time for a structure like this is much cheaper than for a fully automated greenhouse. So let's talk a little bit about movable structures, because that's something that James wanted me to mention. And our 3 movable tunnels at the student farm were movable structures. They were 30 by 96 foot structures. On the top, these top 2 pictures here is an example of. On the right hand side, we moved this structure. This is the very northern structure. High Tunnel 1 is what we called it. We moved this on October 15th, which we actually had the very first frost of the year, and we had our plots already planted with some of our cool hardy salad greens. And then on the left is after we moved it a couple hours later and had it strapped in place, that the frost literally evaporated. And we had the structure in place. So on the bottom right there, you can see a Google Maps image of the high tunnel site at the student farm. So you can see we had these 3 high tunnels, and they each had a corresponding movable location. So the top 2 pictures are actually from that very northern high tunnel that you see there on the left, and we moved that over to the right hand structure where we already had those salad greens planted in place and ready to be protected for winter production. And as you move down, we sort of had them staggered, and they moved back and forth to the respective locations. So this is one high tunnel with 2 movable sites. So some of the sort of attributes and comparison between a fixed tunnel is that a movable tunnel allows you to move the same structure to multiple plots per year. So we talked about getting 3 to 4 crops per year. You can really per square foot, you can really maximize those succession plantings throughout a year if you have a movable structure. It allows for more natural rotation. So what we mean by that is, if we can go back to this last slide, there's a lot of commentary about doing true rotations to avoid disease and insects issues inside high tunnels because it's such a confined space. But as you can see in the bottom picture, if you combine the movable spaces, then you can start to see how you can really rotate crop families around to this various plots and really establish a true crop rotation if you have a movable structure. With a fixed structure, they're a little bit more simpler to put up. They're somewhat permanent in place. If you have utilities like electricity and your frost-free water or year-round water going to your tunnels, it's easier to get utility access to those tunnels themselves. But again, it limits rotations and it limits what you can do with them. And the movable tunnels are a little bit more expensive, but if you want to integrate rotations, if you want to integrate cover cropping, if you want to maximize the use of the covered space, having them movable is super important. So this picture you see here is actually a spring cover crop that we had on one of the alternate sites. So we could grow a cover crop during the outdoor growing season while we were using the high tunnel on the other site, and then we could till that under and get those beds prepped and get all those benefits from that cover crop. By having it outdoors and it being easier to manage and mow and get equipment in there as well. So that's another benefit to having a movable structure. So here's a picture on the right. This is an image from Four Season Tools, just showing you an example of how you can use, so in this case, this is a movable high tunnel that moves to 3 different positions, and showing you how they're actually getting 4 crops from that high tunnel space, but they're moving it to the different positions and how that's working. So at the top on February 15th, they might have salad green mix under low tunnels in there, and we'll look at what that looks like in a second. And then they can, as of April 1st, they can move that to the second site, and when the mesclun mix no longer needs protection, start warming that soil to get it ready to start transplanting tomatoes on May 5th or even as late as the 3rd or 4th week of April. Okay, so that's 2 crops already from that one high tunnel structure. And then towards the end of the summer, when the tunnel no longer needs to be protecting the tomatoes, you can move it off that site to another site to plant a crop like lettuce sort of late in the fall. or you had transplanted that lettuce in the late summer and you're harvesting it sort of in the mid to early fall. And then when you get that crop out of there, you can move it all the way over to the right to the third site for a crop of spinach that you had already planted in position 3. Okay, so you can see how over that space of a whole calendar year, they use that one structure on 3 different sites for 4 different crops. So it can really expand how you use that structure throughout the year for many different sites. And here are some more benefits on the left-hand side that you can read in terms of benefits of movable. So they're a little bit more difficult to manage, a little bit more expensive, but there are a lot of benefits to the movable structures. But I definitely wouldn't recommend moving to these structures until you gain some familiarity with the normal non-movable structures. So really quickly, let's just go through a cropping pattern that we actually utilize at the student farm. And again, this isn't necessarily the only crop pattern that you have to use. We just went over an example just in the previous slide, but this is how we utilized our high tunnel space at the student farm, because the crops in this case that we're going to be talking about, tomatoes, solanaceous crops, and salad greens, are our highest yielding and also highest grossing per square foot crops for the market that we sold these to. So in this slide, what you see right here is on the left hand side, we had just moved the tunnel over a site where we had started planting baby salad green mixes on this site when it was still out of doors and it didn't need the protection. And so we started these plantings probably from the 1st of September through the middle of October. So this is during a time when the outdoor season is completely winding down and we're getting ready to not have anything out in the normal fields. We're just beginning the season all over again in these high tunnel structures. So the tunnels moved over the site probably in the middle of October, end of October. The slide on the right is when we start to bring in our low tunnels. So these are low tunnels inside of our high tunnel. So that's a 2-layer concept. And that adds a little bit more thermal mass protection and holds more of that heat in, especially during the night. And we're moving those low tunnels in probably around when it starts to get consistent hard freezes. So the end of November into early December, we make sure that we have those low tunnels in place. So, and then now we're consistently harvesting and selling to the dining halls all the way through Christmas break. So this next slide, I have a little graph at the top and then 2 pictures to illustrate the point. So we're selling all the way through Christmas, and then we take a few weeks off and we kind of close the tunnels up. And then when we come back, maybe around mid to late January, we're going to reevaluate the system. But let's take a quick step back. That graph at the top right there represents how much temperature protection you actually are really getting. So this was ambient air temperature that we took on December 10th. All the way over on the right, in the top right-hand corner, the ambient air temperature was the nighttime low temperature outside of the tunnel, and it was negative 1.6 degrees Fahrenheit. And if you look right below it, we have the ambient air temperature. FRC stands for floating row cover. So that is the material that makes up our low tunnel. Underneath the floating row cover inside of the high tunnel at that time when that measurement was taken, it was 27.2 degrees. Okay, so that's a huge ambient air temperature difference. It's almost a 30-degree ambient air temperature difference between the outside air temperature and inside that 2-layer system. This was taken on December 10th. So this just shows you that even when it gets really, really cold outside, if you have a 2-layer system like this in place, some of these cold hardy crops can really survive these low temperatures. And that picture on the left is a variety of spinach called Space, and the Encore or All-Star lettuce mix from Johnny's on the right. That picture was taken the day after that December 10th photo, and both of those beds of those greens were perfectly fine. They may have had a little frost on them during that when it reached that 27 degrees under there, but as soon as the sun came out the next day, the frost went away and it was super easy to harvest from inside the low tunnel on that day. The picture on the right is of spinach and red Russian kale, and that picture was taken on January 25th of 2015. This is during the day. The low tunnels are opened up for ventilation purposes, and we had probably already experienced a number of nights that were below 0 ambient air temperature. So this just shows you that the system's working. So that picture on the right is at the end of January, and this is when we'd come in one more time from that fall planting and evaluate whether everything was still quality enough to harvest and bring to market. And then at that point, what we would do is start planting all over again. So we already have one crop cropped off of the high tunnel beds. Here, this represents some crops that we're starting to plant again in the beginning of February. So on the left-hand side, those are spinach transplants, and then on the further left of that is some direct-seeded red Russian kale that we planted probably the first or second week of February, and this picture was probably taken at the end of February, early March, and we have crops actively growing during that period of time. Or on the right, we might have thrown in some head lettuces that we started in our automated greenhouse and transplanted out maybe mid-February to late February, and this picture was taken in maybe mid to late March. So here we go. We've already done one cropping out, and now we've already planted and cropped out another crop before we start thinking about using the tunnels for our warm season production. So here with tomatoes in our case, we would try to plant these out about 6 to 7 weeks earlier than we would out of doors. So that would be about the second week of April in our hardiness zone 5B. So we'd plant out then, and on the left-hand side of this picture, that's on May 25th when we're already starting to actively trellis these tomatoes up. This might be when you might be planting your outdoor tomatoes. We already have tomatoes that are about 3 to 4 feet high and are actively setting green fruit. A week later on the right, June 4th, they've grown probably another 2 feet, and we have lots of green fruit set. And then here, you see on June 20th, or even sometimes earlier than that, on the left-hand side, we already have vine-ripe fruit of New Girl, which is a 60-day tomato from transplant. So this would be about at least a month, if not 5 weeks, before you start getting that early vine-ripe tomatoes from your outdoor production. So if tomatoes are a super high value crop for you at your market, this earliness is really going to help you, and the quality is going to be way, way better than what your outdoor production is. On the right there, that's a green to red bell pepper called Alliance, and that was taken on June 20th as well, and in about 2 weeks, that's going to color up to red. So probably the second week of July, we're already having red, ripe, really high quality colored bell peppers in the high tunnels, whereas you're not getting those outdoors at least until mid-August, and if at all, depending on how wet it was and the sort of moisture conditions in your outdoor fields. So again, that's about a calendar year for us. We would get about 3 crops per square foot from our tunnels. We could push it and get a 4th one, but this just shows you an example of how we can use that tunnel in virtually every single season for some form of production and higher quality production. So let's talk really quickly. Really quick, I see James had a question about, is the 27.2 the temperature at the most center part of the high tunnel or an average? It may be an average. That's just in general, that was some data collected by one of our researchers at that time. I had done some graduate work on winter production, and I had similar data. So it also seemed that when it got even the colder outside, the more protection we would get under that secondary layer. It's really strange, but when the temperatures weren't as cold outside, we would still be getting lots of protection, maybe 10 to 15 degrees of temperature protection difference. But when it was the coldest is when we often saw the greatest difference under that second layer inside that high tunnel. So that's a really good question. So we've talked a little bit about how you can use these hoop structures for in-ground production. Let's really quickly review how you might maximize your fixed cost in this case, okay? Because this is a structure that you might purchase that's going to depreciate over time, and you could be using it for in-ground production, but you could also be using it for other things as well. So I mentioned how you might be able to use a hoop house for transplant production as well. So you could maybe block off part of your high tunnel space, maybe let's say 20 feet of a 48-foot structure, and just heat that 20-foot portion and automate that 20-foot portion and leave the rest of the hoop house structure for in-ground production. So you can maximize that space and start transplants in that area and use the rest of it for in-ground production as well. So there's a lot of growers that are doing that. So here's a picture on the left is from Colin Thompson up at Michigan State University at their North Farm. He created a whole additional room inside of one of their high tunnels that you see here with benches to grow transplants on, and they're only heating that internal room space. They're not heating the rest of the outdoor, the rest of the hoop house outside of that room. So that interior room allows you to use the heat really really efficiently if you want to heat just part of your structure. And on the right, this is from Ben Hartman's farm, Clay Bottom Farm in Goshen, Indiana. He kind of is doing the same thing, but on the right-hand side, he's created a very small little propagation area inside of that hoop house or greenhouse, and he's only heating that specific area to start transplants, and he's not heating the rest of the space itself. So that just kind of gives you an idea of how you might be able to use the structure with another structure inside of it and heat that additional structure to grow transplants in it as well. We have two questions here about cloudy and watering. I'm going to get to that in a little bit. Don't let me forget that when I get to the management section. So you could also use a hoop house structure as a head house or processing area. You also see this quite a bit, where people will put their washing and packing area in the front of their hoop house. So it's a kind of a somewhat of a controlled area to wash and pack their produce, especially if they're doing it during the winter months. So if you're going in there in December and harvesting your salad greens for your market, you don't want to go out to your 3-season washing and packing station that might not be protected and it's super cold outside. You'd want to have a washing and processing area inside the hoop house itself. So you often see folks using their structures for this. Again, maximizing the use of that fixed cost for more than its intended purpose. That's something to think about, especially from a market gardening perspective. The other thing that we often use them for, and a lot of people do this, is curing and drying storage crops. So onions and garlic. These are great structures, in fact, especially during that July-August time of year when you're not really, you might have your tomatoes in there from your early planted tomatoes in your high tunnel, but if you have any extra space, you could set up some benches and use that space as a protected area to cure and dry your garlic and pepper, so you can keep them out of any potential rain contact. You could even put shade cloth over the structure itself to protect it a little bit more from some of the higher temperatures in the middle of summer and direct sun contact with your crops that you're actively curing and drying in there. So there's just a couple examples of how you can use a high tunnel structure not only for in-ground production but for some other uses as well. So really quickly, we'll talk about a few other structures as well. We talked about low tunnels. Low tunnels can also be used out of doors, as you see here in this picture. These are some low tunnels on our alternate site outside of a high tunnel, and they provide some frost protection as well. A little bit lower cost, so 15 cents per square foot for the hoops and maybe the floating row cover fabric or the plastic that you're using. But when you use them outdoors, you really still have to deal with a lot of wind and snow conditions, so you have to take that into account. Whereas when you're using low tunnels inside of a high tunnel, you don't have to worry about wind and snow loads, and they're a little bit easier to manage. So this is usually a place where most growers start with season extension, is using floating row covers or plastic to cover low tunnels over their beds to extend their season just a little bit, maybe early in the spring and a little bit into the fall as well. There's a number of different hoop benders out there. Johnny sells 2 different size hoop benders that you can hook up to a picnic table and use that 1/2-inch electrical metal tubing you can buy at the hardware store to bend a bunch of hoops. You can also use the conduit benders that they sell at the hardware store as well to bend your hoops. So really briefly, let me give a nod to do-it-yourself high tunnels or bend your own high tunnels. This is a little kit at the MSU Student Organic Farms demonstration site where they just bent either 1 3/8-inch top rail from aluminum fencing, or they used the 1.25-inch electrical metal tubing that they just bent with a bender, and they sort of erected a miniature structure that they protected over their raised beds. And something like this you could easily put up in a backyard if you had a little bit of property and you weren't a market gardener. You could still erect something like this. So here's an example. You can't really see what those arrows are pointing at, but so usually this electrical metal tubing you buy or the top rail fencing that you buy at the hardware store, it comes in 10-foot sections. So if you want to make something that's a bow that you can walk under, you need to connect 2 pieces of those together. So in this case, this is 1-inch electrical metal tubing, and the arrow is pointing at the next size up EMT tubing that they cut a little piece off of to connect multiple pieces together to create a larger bow that you can actually walk under. Okay, and you can use, these EMT benders you can buy from the stores. You can use these for EMT tube up to an inch, maybe even an inch and a quarter electrical metal tubing that you buy at the store. And you could, really simply connect pieces like this together and build a very small frame that you could, scale up to however small or big that you wanted, whether commercial application, market gardeners, or for your backyard as well. Let's talk really quickly about caterpillars, modular tunnels, field tunnels. This is all interchangeable. There are kits that you can buy, but this is an example at the student farm of a modular tunnel that we put together from that 1 3/8 inch top rail from the hardware store. They're swedged ends, so on the right-hand side at the very peak there's a swedged end that gets connected, and we put a carriage bolt through it. And Johnny's actually sells a bender similar to that low tunnel bender, where you can bend 2 pieces of the 10-foot sections, connect them at the top, and then use the non-bent pieces of top rail to make the purlins to give it that lengthwise structural stability. And in this case, it was a real simple structure where we just covered it with plastic, used rope that we zigzag over the top of it, connected to bolts at the bottom of the bows, and just that tension with the T-post at either end with the plastic tied to it creates a little miniature caterpillar tunnel that you can use for season extension. So field tunnels, there's a bunch of different ways you can approach this, but you can also scale these up significantly because they're a little bit lower cost per square foot. So, as low as $1.75, maybe even $1 per square foot, depending on your materials. You could really cover a lot more space with these. These are often viewed as 3-season structures because you have to deal with the snow loads. And there's a little bit more less sort of attachment technology, and they're a little bit more difficult to manage in terms of ventilation. But you could use these as sort of glorified, bigger low tunnels that you can walk in to cover larger areas. And I'm going to show you really quickly a calculator that you can get from Johnny's to kind of give you a punch list so you can go source most of this material locally and put these together yourself. So here's just an example from Colin Thompson at Michigan State University's one of their research farms. And here, you could use these during the winter, but you still need to manage the snow. So this is in northern Michigan, almost in the UP. They're having to plow out an area next to the Quonset or caterpillar tunnels to allow that snow that's falling off to be to fall off the tunnels and not drift and form and put pressure on the side. And they're still probably coming in with a broom and pushing snow off the top of these Quonset structures because it'll accumulate and fail if you allow too much to accumulate that way. So here's another modular tunnel that has a little bit fancier where you can build an end wall to it, put in some roll-up side mechanisms, but it's still the bows are made out of that top rail that you buy at the hardware store and bent with that bender you can buy from Johnny's. Real simple stuff. And Johnny's actually, if you go to their website, they have this really cool calculator that you can use. It's a spreadsheet essentially where you punch in the parameters for your space and what you want to do, and it gives you a punch list of all the materials that you need. And in this case, they have a few different types of calculators depending on if you want that real simple structure that we saw a few slides ago, or a structure that has a little bit more end wall structure built into it, the roll-up sides. You can make them as fancy or as simple as you want, but these calculators on their website you can find are really useful for putting together that punch list of materials that you need to acquire in order to do this yourself. So it's totally possible to do it yourself. The only things that I would recommend that you purchase not from the hardware store would be the greenhouse plastic, and then probably if you're going to use wiggle wire to connect it, that wiggle wire and channel lock is something that you would buy from Farm Tech or Rimmel or Johnny's or Knowles Produce Supply. There's a number of different places you can buy the plastic and attachment materials, but the bows, all the hardware to connect it, the wood, all of that can be sourced from your hardware store with a calculator like this. And they also have real simple step-by-step instructions to be able to put a structure like this together. And in the future, we'll probably be offering sort of a hands-on demonstration workshop about how to bend pipe like this and put one of these up. So be on the lookout for that in the future as well. So really quickly, we'll go over some systems management. We have about 10 minutes left. We might run a few minutes over for those of you who need to go if this is your lunch break. Again, this is recorded and we will post this on our YouTube page. In terms of the water management, I don't have a slide. I can almost have a whole separate presentation about water management, but I will say this about watering in the winter is that you are gradually reducing your watering as you move into winter production. So, September and October are very similar to what March and April would look like in the spring in a high tunnel. But as you move into November, December, January, and February, you're doing very, very little watering, particularly for those baby salad greens, because they don't need that much water, and you've already actively grown them for the most part to their harvestable stage. And really, during the middle of the winter, what's going on is that the high tunnel is acting as a root cellar or refrigerator that's just holding those crops, protecting those crops, so when it warms up during the day, you can get in there and actively harvest them. So you do less and less watering all the way down to maybe as little as once a month in the middle of the winter, depending on how cloudy or sunny it is. So in terms of the cloudy, sunniness, in terms of harvesting, that's a really good question. Typically, we're waiting for that 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. type of day during a somewhat sunny or dappled sunlight day. Even in the middle of winter, that'll be enough sunlight to thaw the system out inside of the high tunnel so you can get in there and do some active harvesting. But the other thing to mind with this slide is that the high tunnels are great. We talked about a lot of their benefits and what you can do, but they can be very management intensive. So you need to consider your water management, your nutrients. You still need to have pest and disease management program in place. Even though it's reduced, you still need to have something in place. Weed cultivation is still important, especially if you're not using landscape fabric and mulches. Ventilation, heating. Okay, and it's a longer season, so you're doing a lot more plantings as well. So in terms of crop selection, a lot of different crops can be grown in a hoop house, and I can send you a packet of material that gives some very precise planting dates and variety selections. The cool season crops can be grown in the winter and shoulder months. The warm season crops can be started much earlier, but really what you need to be thinking about is selecting crops based on their market value, especially if you're a market gardener. Okay, so you need to compare sort of your gross revenues per square foot per week or per square foot per crop or the whole season. So usually outdoors we think of yields per acre, maybe gross revenues per acre. Inside of the tunnels, this is our most valuable real estate on the farm where we can get the highest quality. So we want to focus on those crops that give us the highest returns per square foot. So I'm just going to, instead of breaking all that down, just a general measure or metric of $5 to $15 per square foot, either per season or per crop potentially, is kind of a metric that you want to go for. If when you're collecting all your records and doing your enterprise budget analysis for your crops, if it's not giving you a gross yield of at least $5 per square foot, either for crop or the season that you're using it in, you might want to reevaluate whether you should be growing that crop inside of the tunnels themselves. The salad green crops, the quick turnaround crops, and the tomatoes are definitely really valuable because you can grow either a lot of them in there, a quick turnaround time, or they're just really popular crops. So those are some of the things you need to think about with crop selection. In terms of crop scheduling, this is just a real general overview that's showing you all the possibilities of either planting, harvesting, or different things you could be doing in a tunnel throughout the calendar year. And what I want you to notice is that you look at the crops in the left column, warm season or cool season crops, root crops, baby salad green crops. If you look across the entire calendar year, what I want you to notice is that in every single month, they're harvesting something. That H stands for harvesting. So again, looking at this, the crop scheduling patterns and management is super intensive, but this shows that you can actually be doing something in these tunnels virtually every single month of the year. And this is just a general slide. I can send all the participants a packet of information that goes into a little bit more detailed about specific varieties and dates. Okay, James asked a question about tomato varieties. There are specific tomato varieties that do better in high tunnel settings. So if you're looking at your Johnny Selected Seeds or High Mowing or your seed catalogs, a lot of times they have specific varieties that work better in hoop houses than in outdoor fields. But I can send you some information that has more details about crop scheduling. So fertility is something that is also a completely separate webinar I could be doing with high tunnels. The thing that you need to know is that importantly is that you want to still be managing fertility, but when it comes to winter production, you need to keep an eye out for high nitrate levels that can accumulate in the soil and in the crops themselves, and that has to do with the lower light conditions in the winter. So if you're looking to put on a compost for your winter production crops, I would avoid manure-based compost and go with more of a plant-based material if you're in organic or if you're certified organic, or that's just how you want to manage your fertility. Avoid those high nitrogen or high manure or salt-based fertilizers that might really shoot up those nitrate levels in low light conditions and cause some problems. And you want to monitor salt levels in everything that you're applying. So the compost, any fertilizers or manures you're applying, and then also your irrigation water. You can get testing and request testing for all these different inputs to make sure that they don't have super high salt levels, whether it's sodium or the potassiums or any of the salts, whether it's a fertilizer or sodium. You want to make sure that salt levels aren't super high. In terms of testing your tunnels, your soil test, there's a test out there called the saturated media extract test that's actually used more for container media or greenhouse media, that if you have a tunnel that's not movable and you're constantly putting a lot of compost in there and treating it more like a potting soil than a regular agricultural soil, get that saturated media extract test because it'll give you a better idea of your nutrient loads and salt loads than a traditional soil test will. And also get an organic matter test, because the saturated media extract tests don't typically have organic matter as part of the testing suite, so you want to monitor those levels. And that last bullet, shooting for 6 to 9% organic matter, is a target you can reach, because it's a smaller area that you're managing. You can add lots of organic matter, a mixture of different types of organic matter, whether that's green residues from cover crops or compost or manures. You can really quickly shoot up your organic matter level in there. And if you have that 6 to 9% organic matter level, you're in good shape. If you need to add additional nitrogen, some crops like tomatoes, they will want up to 180 to 200 pounds of nitrogen per acre. You can extrapolate down that to the square foot level. You could do some pre-plant nitrate testing in your soil, and the media extract test will do that. But if you really want to get a snapshot, particularly for like your tomato crop, what's going on with nitrogen in the middle of the year, doing petiole sap testing during the season is the way to go. And you can buy meters that do this. They're kind of expensive, but if you're a commercial grower, they tend to purchase these meters. But you can also take samples of your tissue from your tomatoes and send that into the lab, and they can give you an idea of where you're at with certain nutrient levels in the soil. So let's really quickly talk about some additional tips here. And we'll just kind of really quickly go through this because we're starting to run out of time. These are just some additional tips when it comes to low tunnels, mulches, and additional heat input that I just want to this is like the latest thinking when it comes to using these systems with high tunnels. It's important, particularly for the warm season crops like tomatoes that you plant early, that they get off to a real quick start. So you might want to have your low tunnel still set up in your high tunnel, as you can see in the top right hand picture here. When we planted tomatoes in April, we cover them with that low tunnel to give them that little bit of extra heat. So even though the temperature at night might only be getting down to like 40 degrees, you want to give them as much heat boost as you can to really get those tomatoes off and going. And in this case, we're also using black landscape fabric or black plastic mulch to really get those things going. When it comes to using the low tunnel systems, the closer the low tunnel to the crop, the better. So if you can get that low tunnel material 18 inches or less, or in some cases with some non-fragile crops like some spinach or salad greens, you could even lay that crop directly on the material, the crop material itself. Okay, our tunnels, low tunnels, were a little bit higher than that, and we didn't have huge issues with it. But just keep in mind that the closer the low tunnel material to the plant material, the more protection that you're going to get. Okay, and then ventilating the low tunnels is super important too. So on every single sunny day, like you see in the top right hand picture, like you saw on a previous slide, we're going in there and moving the row cover off there to maximize ventilation. Because even in the middle of winter, you can still have disease problems if you don't have maximum ventilation and airflow. Downy mildew with lettuce and spinach is a big issue. So selecting disease resistant varieties and maximizing ventilation is super important. So even if it's cloudy all week in the middle of the winter, I would still recommend getting in there and moving those low tunnels off of the crops or off of the hoops at least 2 to 3 times a week. Okay, you could add thicker layers of row cover or even plastic to your low tunnels. But again, you need light for the system. So the more layers you add, the less light is getting to the soil, and therefore the less effective the microclimate is. So you need to keep that in mind when adding layers. If you're moving the layer off every single day, then you could add really thick layers and get a little bit more temperature protection, but the system needs light. Keep that in mind. In terms of supplemental heat, so some growers, in terms of trying to get regrowth, particularly with salad green crops in the middle of winter, if you are adding a little bit of heat, you're going to get better and more predictable regrowth on some of those crops. So if you want to keep your a real standard safe low temperature, if you want to add some minimal heat to the structure, 28 degrees Fahrenheit is considered a safe low. So if you had a heater like this Resner propane heater, you could add a minimal amount of heat, keep the thermostat set at 28 degrees Fahrenheit, and all those cold-hardy crops are going to do fine. The question is there the return on investment with that additional heat input? Are you getting more production and better regrowth in these heated tunnels versus the unheated tunnels? A lot of growers would say that they would question that and say that you aren't, and that cost of propane might be better saved for your growing your transplants early in the season rather than trying to keep your mid-winter crops alive. Okay, and it's also that second bullet talking about the average daily temperature. So thinking about maybe increasing the daytime temperature to increase your overall average daily temperature is probably more important than making sure that every single night that the greenhouse is not falling before 28 degrees. So you can add heat, but it adds some additional management issues to it that you might not see. So ventilate. That's super, super important. Have a vent in your end walls, and keep that open even during the winter months. Even a slightly leaky greenhouse is better than fully sealed. Having that stagnant warm air even in the middle of winter moving out of the tunnel is super important to reduce things like downy mildew in your tunnel. So ventilating is super important. You can use mulches. If you're using black plastic mulches, make sure they're tightly fit to the beds, and that can increase the soil temperature in the early spring when you're trying to get your tomatoes in there earlier. So you're creating the microclimate, but you're also warming the soil and getting those tomatoes off to a real quick start. And here, that top right picture, you see, you could plant like heading greens or cooking greens into plastic too in the winter, pull those out, and then plant something else in those same slots all over again, so you can maximize your use of that space. Landscape fabric is good. It does warm the soil a little bit and controls weeds, but it doesn't warm the soil quite as well as a black plastic would that's tightly fit to the beds themselves. Really quickly, just a nod to pruning for those of you interested in growing tomatoes. I never often get to this, and I just want to talk a little bit about this before we finish. When it comes to pruning in tunnels, it depends on whether we're growing indeterminates versus determinates. So if we're growing determinates, we're usually growing indeterminates. We're usually growing to a single stem. Sometimes with heirlooms or grafted tomatoes and some varieties, we might want to grow to two stems. And the important thing is, when you're doing two stems, to prune to this strong Y pattern that you see here. And that usually means allowing the main stem and one strong sucker early on to establish, but then pruning out all the other suckers and usually leaves below the fruiting clusters as you harvest them and move up the vine. So especially with the indeterminates, if you're doing one stem, as you move up, you're pruning out all the suckers, and as you remove the fruiting clusters and harvest them, you're removing the leaves and suckers below those tomatoes. This is a classic European sort of Dutch style technique, but it's really going to help with disease prevention and optimizing the yield and quality of those tomatoes. With determinates, and you're not training it to a single stem, and you'll see what this looks like in a second, you want to prune to that strong Y pattern that you see, remove the first couple leaves and suckers, and then focus on pruning them in what we call a basket weave pattern, and only doing any additional pruning if you have lots of runners that are coming out into the aisles during the year, very carefully pruning those out. But we're not doing it as intensive pruning for those determinate tomatoes in the high tunnels. So here's kind of what that looks like. So on the right hand side picture, you see an indeterminate variety pruned to one stem, growing up some string that you will see here in a second, and we're pruning out all the leaves and additional suckers. And on the left-hand side, those are determinate tomatoes in a basket weave, where we did a little bit of initial pruning, but then we're weaving string between the plants, between those stakes down the rows, to kind of create a little bit of a short fence of tomatoes. And that's a better way to prune and trellis your determinates, both in the field and in the high tunnels. But with the indeterminates, we're typically training them to either 1 or 2 stems and training them up some trellising twine or string and using some tomato clips to hold it to the vine. So here's what those usually sometimes the string comes on spools like this that you could hook to some wire that you have running above on the truss structure of the high tunnel. You hook that to that, and then there's enough string that usually lasts 4 to 5 years on these spools. And then here on the right hand side, you can see those little black clips that clip to the string and then clip around the main leader of the tomato, and you gradually add those clips as the tomato gets trained up. You could wind the tomato vine around, but a lot of times you could get some cut off or some of the string growing into the stem, and you might damage the plant. So a lot of times you can use these plastic clips that are reusable that they can reuse every single year. So these are some aids that you can use for helping out. So the lower lean technique, this is just, again, this idea of pruning all the suckers and leaves up to the harvesting, the cluster that we're harvesting. And with those spools, what they allow you to do on the previous slide is that you can actually lower the string down, so you can lower the plant and lean. So this isn't a good example, this picture, but what it means is that you can see at the bottom here, there's probably 3, 4, 5 feet of tomato stem where all the leaves and fruiting clusters have been removed. They lowered the plant from that spool, and they can lean it off to the side, so you can get better access to the higher up clusters, and you can kind of lean and lower the tomatoes, and eventually at the end of the season they might even be laying completely on their side. This is an advanced technique, and we may even have a future webinar that just focuses on tomatoes and how you might manage those in a high tunnel setting. So really quickly, I know we're running a little bit over on time right now, but again, this is recorded. I just want to give a quick nod to some of you who are thinking, oh, what are some resource programs I can use to maybe purchase these tunnels? So, really quickly, I'll just off the top, the USDA and the FSA, they have a microloan program with really low interest rates. If you can't get traditional financing for a structure like this from a bank, they're usually called microloans, the FSA microloan program, where you can get loans up to $50,000 at like 2% interest. So you can use those loans to purchase structures like this as well. The lower cost sort of modular field tunnels, depending on how big you make them, you can anywhere from $800 to $1,500. That might be something you could finance or save up for if you want to just get started. This program here is the NRCS Equip High Tunnel program. That's now, if you look for it, it's under the specialty, they call it the specialty crop program, but there's actually a new round of funding coming out in 2017 specifically for urban ag in Cook County, because those the county that I work in has been traditionally overlooked when it comes to some of this equip funding for high tunnels. But what essentially it means is there's an application that you have to fill out. You usually have to have control of the land and utilize some of their recommended conservation practices for runoff and erosion control. But if you get accepted in the program, because it's competitive funds and there's based on a ranking system, and if you're a beginning farmer, a veteran, underserved audiences, you get additional points. It's essentially a cost-sharing program. So in 2015, you see they will put up $8,500 to the purchase of a tunnel. So that means you could purchase a tunnel or maybe even multiple tunnels up to $17,000, and they would kick in half of that money for you to purchase the tunnel. It may require some additional annual monitoring of the data of the land that you had it in beforehand and some of the records that you're keeping for 3 years with the tunnel production. So there are some stipulations with it, but there are some programs out there that can help you finance and also just straight out purchase these tunnels at a little bit of a reduced cost. Okay, so that was my last slide. If anyone's still on and they have some questions, feel free to type them in the chat box, and we can answer them. Otherwise, like I said, this is recorded, and we'll post this and send this link out to everyone so they can review it. I know a lot of material was covered here, But I just wanted to give you kind of as broad an overview as possible to know what you're getting into with high tunnel production. So with that, I will take any questions in the chat box, and I see someone might be typing one, Kim Isaacson. And also, like I said, I have some PDF packets of information in terms of planting dates, some additional information about building smaller mini tunnels that I can send to the group to help you get started. James, do you have any announcements or anything that you want to point out or any questions? So Lynette asked the question, do you still get temperature advantage on cloudy days with the double hoop system? Absolutely. It's not as much of a difference as the outdoor temperature, but you're getting some temperature differences. I mean, it may be down to more like 5 to 10 degrees of air temperature difference, but you're still getting a significant amount of protection. And the other thing to consider that it's not just temperature. One of the reasons why especially cold hardy crops succumb to the hard freezes is also has to do with wind. Wind is a huge factor in all of this that we're not considering. Just the same as humans experience, wind chill factor, plants to some degree also sort of experience wind chill to a degree too, because it has a real drying effect, and that additional compounding wind chill effect causes those plants to fail. So you can never discount the wind chill factor as well. So yes, there's less temperature difference on cloudy days, but it's still a significant enough microclimate for certain cold hardy crops that the system generally tends to work. Some of the crops start to succumb and the quality gets reduced in the middle of the winter. But again, that's why when I gave that analogy of reevaluating the crops that we were bringing to dining before we do one last harvest, and then we'll just go ahead and plant again. So some temperature advantage still, not as much as non-cloudy days. But to give you an example of a sunny day in the middle of the winter, so say that January 15th, it's 25 degrees outside, but it's sunny. It could be 75, 80 degrees inside of the tunnel. I'll have to get in there, go out there full in my Carhartt's winter jacket. I'll have to take everything off just to work in that tunnel in the middle of January. So just to give you, the temperature range can be vast, but the microclimate protection and creation that you're getting is significant enough, even and consistent enough, even for commercial production. Andy asked, can the low tunnels be used to harden off transplants? Absolutely. That's a really good point. And if you had your greenhouse within your high tunnel, so you created a separate heated room inside your high tunnel, you can move those transplants gradually, stepwise, in matriculated fashion from that heated space to the high tunnel space to your outdoor space. So that's a really good point you brought up. We often would, our production high tunnel space, our transplant production space was a separate structure. We would sometimes bring those tomatoes down, our transplants down, put them in the tunnel for a few days to kind of harden them off before we plant them in the ground and get them going. So you can absolutely use it to harden them off. That's a good question. Have you ever tried to insulate under raised beds in the tunnel? Lynette, that's a really good question and a good point. No, some people have done that, and on the slide that we were talking about supplemental heat, there are folks who are adding soil heat, so through PVEX water tubing or other methods. So you can absolutely you could insulate under raised beds if you wanted to, but just keep in mind that with initial site preparation and getting that soil ready and those beds ready, it's going to be at a greater expense. The one thing a lot of people are doing is they are insulating the sort of buffer along the outside of the tunnel. So they might be putting, when they're laying down, maybe some drainage or French drain or drain tube along the outside of the tunnel to deal with that rainfall or the snow shed from the tunnel. They're also laying down some insulated boards, maybe like R50 boards that you get from Menards for a home, along the outside of the tunnel, and that gives a little bit of insulation along the outside and protects the edge beds a little bit better than the inner beds, because there is some edge effect with the tunnel. So that's a good question. There is some insulating you could do, but I would tend to do it on the sort of minimalist side as much as possible. You have to think about the cost inputs. So Christina's asking, if you were planting in a new high tunnel, would you recommend planting into the ground or into raised beds? Really great question. This is what I would say in general, depending on where you're growing in an urban, peri-urban, or more rural situation. I would always try to grow in the soil if you can. Okay, because if you're bringing in material to create raised beds, like you're bringing in like 2x10 timbers, and you're bringing in topsoil and compost, which we do that a lot in these urban settings that maybe have contaminated heavy metal soils. That's an additional expense. So you're not able to use the native soil. You're having to bring in compost and topsoil, having to bring in the materials to create the raised bed. So that's an additional expense on top of the infrastructure for the high tunnel itself. So I would recommend ruling out growing in the soil, the native soil, before you think about creating raised bed structures in the tunnel. And if your point was the not structure material for raised beds, but just flat on the surface versus raising the bed up, then I absolutely would be doing that. Raised beds, I consider raised beds to both be non-structural raised beds, where you're just kind of mounding the soil up anywhere from 2 inches to additional foot around the existing grade, or structural raised beds where you're actually bringing in materials to create raised beds and pile soil inside of those raised beds themselves. So raised beds, yes, whether they're structured or structureless, but in terms of using the native soil, I would rule out not being able to use the native soil before importing soil and compost, because you have to think about that being an additional cost to establishing the site in the first place. So that's a really good question. And again, you can do heavy metal testing if you're concerned about soil contamination. There's lead testing, like chromium, cadmium, arsenic testing you can do from the same labs that you're getting your basic soil test done at. They can give you heavy metal results, so you can evaluate whether or not you can grow in that soil to begin with, and rule out having to bring in material for a raised bed. So that's a really good question. Awesome. Well, that's some really good feedback, some really good dialogue there. Like I said, I will record this, get this up as soon as possible, and we'll send a link out to you so you can review this, and I will send you an information packet as well. So if there's no further questions, thank you everyone, and keep on the lookout for future workshops from our statewide team and from me up in Cook County related to high tunnel webinars or actual hands-on workshops in the future. So have a great afternoon, everyone.